The Honorable Preston Manning has been teaching us what we can learn about our public life by taking the principles of the Bible and applying them in the widest of ways to how we take care of each other in politics and in many areas of public life. And Preston, you believe there are temptations that we can learn from in the life of Jesus that we should still be applying today. What do you mean?
Well, there's this classic story of the temptation of Jesus at the beginning of his very beginning of his ministry, and then the story is that the forces of evil, Satan, came and tried to influence the direction of his public life. And I think anybody in public life faces these same temptations. The great Russian author Dostoevsky told this story best in his book, The Brothers Karamazov. But the way Dostoevsky tells it, the devil comes to him and says, "You want people to follow you? Feed them. Just feed them. Don't go talking about spiritual bread and spiritual liberty and all that.
Give them money."
They won't understand what you're doing. Just pave the road, feed them. And Jesus rejected it. He says people do need bread. But man doesn't live by bread alone. So then Satan comes to him and says, "Well, give them a show. You get on the top of the temple, jump off, have your father's angels catch you just before you hit the ground. It'll make YouTube. It'll get on the evening news. You'll give them a show and they'll follow you." And Jesus rejected that approach. And then the last one, which is the most diabolical temptation, it says he showed Jesus all the kingdoms, all the political kingdoms of the world, all the politics, the U.S. Congress, the Kremlin, I'm stretching it a bit. He showed him all that, and he says, all this political power I'll give you, and then you can implement your spiritual agenda if you worship me. And Jesus rejected that too. And I think for political leaders, particularly today, the temptation to cater to people's most immediate basic need, you got to address that, but that's not enough. The temptation of image politics is just give them a show and they'll follow you if you can give them the right show. But this other temptation, and Christians are subject to this, is seize the instruments of the state and use that to impose your spiritual agenda. Jesus categorically rejected that.
Which is one benefit of a separation of church and state.
Yeah, but also to recognize, Lorna, that you can't implement a spiritual agenda with the instruments of the state. Like no. Jesus wanted, it wasn't that Jesus didn't have a spiritual agenda, but he wanted the people to choose to follow him by the exercise of their free will, not by being coerced into it by promises of bread, by a show, or by the use of political power.
You know, as people who carry the Christian story, it is so tempting to think, I'll go for all those three things. And what you would say, the lesson we learn from the temptations is you just go in humbly with the true story of you must give your life to Christ.
And you challenge people to choose to follow him or choose to adopt these spiritual principles by the exercise of your free will, not by coercion. And anybody that tries to coerce you into that, including Christian people, you better be careful about that kind of person. Jesus rejected that approach to getting a following.
Let's talk about communication, the incarnational communication of Jesus. What would we take from that?
Well, first recognize how exceptional he is. His public career apparently lasted only 36 months, but 2,000 years later, over 1 billion people know his name, more than that, and profess to be guided in some way by his teachings. I mean, so the guy must have been a pretty good communicator, and he didn't have all the technology that we have today. And I think the three characteristics of his style, first of all, he embodied the things that he was talking about. They weren't just abstract things. When he talked about love, he embodied it and demonstrated it, didn't just talk about it. Secondly, he immersed himself in the community that he was endeavoring to influence. 18 years probably in the carpenter shop, listening to farmers and merchants and tradespeople and whatever, to 1 year and then to 3 years of public ministry, 6 years of preparation in the community to 1 year of service in the public arena. Imagine if we required every MP to spend 6 years of preparation for every 1 year that you're going to spend in the Parliament. And then thirdly, he's trying to communicate concepts of a high level of abstraction, the nature of God, eternal life, forgiveness, evil. I mean, these are high-level concepts, but he used the language of the ordinary folks. He talked about seed in a field, pearls in a box, lights in the candles in the darkness. He used the vocabulary of the people he's talking about too. And today, it's what the communication consultants call receiver-oriented communication. You put yourself in the shoes of the receiver. You don't say, I'm going to tell you what I think the way I want to say it in my language with my media. He was just an exceptional communicator. And we can learn a lot. Politics today is 90% communication. We can learn a lot about incarnational, receiver-oriented communication from Jesus of Nazareth.
Preston Manning, Faith, Leadership, and Public Life. Your book is chock-a-block full of thoughtful challenges to how we should be taking our relationship with Jesus and living it out in a very public way. Thank you for sharing it with 100
Well,
Helps.
thank you, Lorna.